Leandro Voss stood in the doorway, his fists clenched so tightly his nails dug into his palms. Across the dimly lit hotel room, Maritza Voss was tangled in the arms of Dr. Nolan Hensley, their bodies too close, their betrayal too blatant. The air in the room was thick with the scent of perfume and sweat, proof of the affair that had been happening behind his back. In that moment, something inside Leandro snapped. There was no more doubt, no more denial, only the cold, unforgiving certainty that neither of them would leave this room alive. Leandro Voss had always believed in the foundation of his marriage. From the moment he met Maritza, he had been drawn to her charm, intelligence, and the way she carried herself with effortless grace. Their love story had been the kind that others admired. A decade of marriage, 2 beautiful children, a thriving home in a quiet, affluent neighborhood. On the outside, they were the perfect couple, the kind that friends envied and family praised. But perfection, as Leandro would soon learn, was nothing more than an illusion. Maritza had always been a woman of routine. She woke up early, prepared breakfast for the children, and ensured their home ran smoothly while Leandro spent long hours at his job as a software engineer. She attended social events, maintained friendships, and was well liked in their community. Leandro had no reason to question her loyalty. He had given her a life of comfort, and in return, she had given him stability. At least, that was what he had always thought. It was subtle at first, a shift so small that it barely registered as something unusual. Maritza had always been attentive, always present. But then she started becoming distracted. It began with small things, missed calls, forgetful moments, unexplained absences. She claimed to be busy with errands, but when Leandro asked what she had been doing, her answers were vague. Her phone, once left carelessly on countertops, was now always in her hands, her screen angled away from his view. Leandro noticed the change but convinced himself that he was imagining things. He worked long hours, often late into the night, and blamed himself for the distance that had grown between them. Perhaps Maritza was lonely. Perhaps she needed more attention. Maybe she was just tired of the monotony that came with being a stay-at-home wife and mother. He reasoned that it was nothing serious, just a passing phase, the kind all couples went through. But the signs kept piling up. She had started taking more interest in her appearance, new dresses, expensive perfumes, a sudden urge to go to the gym. It wasn't just that she wanted to look good. She wanted to impress someone. The realization gnawed at Leandro, but still, he ignored it, unwilling to accept the possibility of betrayal. He told himself that his wife was just trying to feel better about herself. After all, they were not young anymore. People changed and relationships evolved. There was no reason to assume the worst. Then came the doctor's visits. Maritza had never been one to obsess over her health, yet suddenly she was scheduling frequent checkups. Headaches, stomach pains, back issues. There was always something wrong, always a reason to see Dr. Nolan Hensley, their trusted family physician. Leandro found it odd but not alarming. Hensley had been their doctor for years, a man he trusted, a man who had treated their children since birth. It never crossed his mind that there could be anything more. Looking back, he should have seen the truth sooner. The way Maritza's eyes brightened when Hensley's name came up in conversation, the way she rushed to get dressed when she had an appointment, the extra time she spent in front of the mirror before heading out. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. But Leandro, blinded by love and trust, refused to see it. His suspicions only became undeniable when he noticed the lingering scent of cologne on her clothes, one that wasn't his. It was subtle but distinct, a fragrance he had never smelled on her before. It followed her home from her so-called errands, clinging to her like a shadow. One evening he embraced her, pulling her close as he had done so many times before, but something felt off. The warmth between them had faded, replaced by something cold and distant. Maritza was still there, but her heart belonged elsewhere. Leandro told himself he was being paranoid. That was until he saw it, the message on her phone, a single notification that shattered the last of his doubts. It was brief, just a few words, but it was enough to confirm everything he had feared. His wife was having an affair. And the man she had chosen over him was the very person he had trusted with his family's well-being. A storm of emotions surged within him, betrayal, rage, heartbreak. But even in that moment, Leandro did not react. He did not confront her, did not demand answers. Instead, he took a deep breath, swallowed his pain, and forced himself to think. If Maritza and Dr. Hensley thought they could deceive him, they were wrong. Leandro knew what he had to do. He would not lose his wife to another man. He would not let his family fall apart. The betrayal had been set in motion, but the game was far from over, and this time it would be Leandro who dictated how it would end. Leandro Voss had never been a man prone to suspicion. He had always believed that trust was the foundation of a strong marriage, the very thing that kept a family intact. But now, that trust had been shattered. He could no longer deny the truth. That was right in front of him. Maritza was having an affair, and the man she was involved with was none other than Dr. Nolan Hensley, the one person Leandro had never thought to question. The betrayal cut deeper than he had expected, leaving a hollow ache in his chest that refused to fade. Despite the rage building inside him, Leandro forced himself to remain calm. He needed proof, undeniable evidence that would confirm everything, before he made his next move. Acting on impulse would be reckless. If Maritza and Hensley thought they were being careful, he would show them that they weren't careful enough. He would watch, observe, and wait for the right moment. His first step was to monitor her behavior more closely. He paid attention to her patterns, her excuses, and the small inconsistencies in her stories. She claimed to be meeting friends for lunch, yet when he casually asked about the details later, her answers were vague. She said she was running errands, yet he noticed receipts for places she had no reason to visit. But what bothered him, most was how she seemed to glow after returning from her so-called outings. Her mood lighter, her eyes filled with something that had nothing to do with him. Leandro took things further, going through her phone when she was asleep. He had never invaded her privacy before, but now he had no choice. At first, he found nothing: deleted messages, cleared call logs, an attempt to cover her tracks. But Maritza wasn't as careful as she thought. She had overlooked her email, where he found a series of appointments that had nothing to do with medical concerns. Each one lined up with the days she had gone out without a solid explanation. The clinic visits weren't about checkups. They were about something else entirely. His heart pounded as he pieced together the timeline. The affair wasn't recent. It had been going on for months, possibly longer. He felt sick thinking about how many times he had trusted her, how many nights he had kissed her goodnight while she was thinking of another man. The weight of that realization threatened to consume him, but he refused to let it. Instead of confronting Maritza, Leandro made another decision. He hired a private investigator. If he was going to take action, he needed more than circumstantial evidence. He needed photos, timestamps, undeniable proof of her betrayal. It didn't take long. Within a week, the investigator provided everything. Images of Maritza meeting Dr. Hensley at a secluded restaurant, the way they leaned in close, how they left together, disappearing into a hotel room. There was no mistaking what was happening. Leandro stared at the photos, gripping them so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The proof was in his hands, yet it only confirmed what he had already known in his gut. He imagined Maritza in that hotel room, her body tangled with another man's, whispering words meant only for him. The betrayal burned, but with the pain came clarity. There was no salvaging this marriage. There was no forgiveness. He had wasted too much time believing in a love that no longer existed. Still, he didn't confront her. Not yet. Instead, he studied every detail of the investigators' report, the locations, the times, how often they met. He memorized it all, committing each betrayal to memory. He needed to understand how deep this went, how far Maritza had strayed. If she had been capable of this deception, then how much more had she hidden from him? In the days that followed, Leandro maintained his facade. He kissed her goodbye in the mornings, asked about her day, pretended that nothing had changed, but inside he was unraveling. He watched as she dressed up for her outings, knowing exactly who she was going to see. He noticed the way she held her phone a little too tightly, the way she avoided his gaze when he asked about her plans. She was living a lie, but soon the lie would come crashing down around her. He began making his own plans. He considered exposing her publicly, making her shame known to everyone. He thought about confronting Dr. Hensley, making him feel the same humiliation he had suffered. But neither of those options felt right. They weren't enough. The pain she had inflicted on him wasn't something that could be resolved with mere confrontation. He wanted her to feel the weight of her actions, to experience the same devastation that had torn through him. Leandro wasn't just seeking revenge. He was planning something final, something that would ensure that neither Maritza nor Hensley would ever betray him again. Leandro Voss had always considered himself a man of control, but as days passed, the storm inside him raged stronger. The images of Maritza with Dr. Nolan Hensley haunted him, replaying in his mind like a cruel punishment he couldn't escape. Every time she smiled at him, every time she spoke as if nothing had changed, his stomach twisted in disgust. She had no idea that he knew everything. He studied her movements with more intensity than before, noticing the smallest details. How her voice softened when she sent a text, the way she took longer to get ready, the unnecessary perfume she wore, even when she claimed she was only running errands. Each action fueled his fury, but instead of lashing out, he remained patient. He wanted her to believe she was safe, that her secret was still buried. Leandro spent nights in his home office pretending to work, but instead planning. He mapped out every detail of what he would do next. The crime had to be flawless, executed in such a way that no one would suspect him. A crime of passion would be too obvious. He had to ensure it looked like something else entirely. He considered multiple ways to get rid of them, but in the end he settled on something poetic, something that mirrored the deceit she had committed. He would use her own affair against her. He needed a place where he could control the scene, where no interruptions would come. Their home was too risky. The clinic was too public. But the hotel they so often used? That was the perfect spot. The investigator had given him everything. He needed to know dates, times, room numbers. Maritza and Hensley were creatures of habit. They met at the same place every Wednesday afternoon, thinking they were being discreet. What they didn't know was that Leandro had already been inside that very room before. He had studied the exits, the cameras, the blind spots. He knew how to get in unnoticed. The plan required patience, but the wait was almost over. Leandro took extra steps to cover his tracks, ensuring that no suspicion would ever fall on him. He made sure to use his credit card openly at different locations on the day of their next meeting, creating an airtight alibi. He staged his schedule so that anyone who might ask would confirm that he was busy elsewhere. The day arrived, and Leandro felt nothing but a cold, steady determination. He drove to the hotel early, parking in a lot far enough away to avoid cameras. A disguise covered his features. Nothing elaborate, just enough to make him unrecognizable if anyone happened to glance his way. He had a key, one he had stolen, weeks ago when Maritza had carelessly left her purse unattended. Inside the dimly lit room, Leandro waited. He had thought about bringing a weapon, but in the end, he decided against it. He wanted this to be personal, to feel every second of it. His hands would be the last thing Maritza felt. Minutes stretched into an eternity until finally he heard the door click open. He stood in the shadows, heart pounding but his mind eerily calm. Maritza entered first, laughing softly, her voice dripping with affection meant for someone else. Hensley followed, his arm casually around her waist, oblivious to the presence lurking in the room. Leandro took a deep breath, stepping forward just as the door shut behind them. This was it. The moment of reckoning. Maritza had betrayed him, and now she would pay the price. The moment Maritza turned around and saw him standing in the shadows, her entire body froze. Her eyes widened in horror, her breath hitching in her throat. Dr. Nolan Hensley was slower to react, still lost in the haze of desire, his hands lingering on her waist. But within seconds, the air in the room changed. The warmth, the secrecy, the thrill of their affair, all of it shattered as the reality of Leandro's presence set in. Leandro didn't speak. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. Maritza took a shaky step back, her body trembling as she reached for Hensley's arm, but the doctor was no better off. His face had lost all color, his confidence vanishing in the face of an enraged husband. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, in a sudden, violent motion, Leandro lunged. His hands found Hensley first, fingers closing around the doctor's throat with unrelenting force. The betrayal, the humiliation, the months of deception, everything poured into that grip. Hensley struggled, clawing at Leandro's hands, but Leandro didn't let go. His strength was fueled by rage, by the images burned into his mind of this man touching his wife, of the stolen moments they had shared. Maritza screamed, her voice cracking with desperation as she tried to pry Leandro off the doctor, but her efforts were useless. Hensley's legs thrashed beneath him as he was shoved against the hotel wall, his head slamming hard against the surface. His gasps for air became weaker, his struggles fading as darkness consumed him. Leandro only let go when the doctor's body went limp. He took a step back, chest rising and falling heavily as he stared at the crumpled form at his feet. Hensley's body twitched slightly before stilling completely, his eyes staring at nothing. The affair had ended. Maritza's. Sobs filled the room as she dropped to her knees beside her lover's lifeless form. Her hands trembled as she touched his face, as if willing him to wake up. But he wouldn't. He never would. Leandro turned his gaze to her, and she flinched as if burned. The betrayal she had inflicted was now reflected in the fear on her face. She wasn't looking at her husband anymore. She was looking at a murderer. She scrambled backward, desperate to put distance between them, but Leandro was faster. He grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her up with a force that made her stumble. She begged, her words incoherent, her breaths ragged, but it didn't matter. Nothing she could say would undo what had been done. He didn't hesitate. His hands closed around her throat just as they had with Hensley. Maritza thrashed, her nails digging into his arms, her body twisting as she fought for air. But Leandro had already made up his mind. She had taken everything from him, his love, his trust, his dignity. Now, he would take everything from her. Her struggles grew weaker, her limbs losing strength until finally her body went still in his grip. He held on for a few seconds longer, ensuring there was no life left, no betrayal that could continue. Then, with slow, measured movements, he let her lifeless form slide to the floor beside Hensley's. The room was silent now. No more laughter, no more whispered secrets, just the heavy weight of death lingering in the air. Leandro stepped back, staring at what he had done. The two lovers lay side by side, their affair now sealed in finality. But he wasn't done yet. He had come prepared, and he knew exactly what had to happen next. If he wanted to walk away from this unscathed, he had to make it look like something else, something that wouldn't lead back to him. And so, with the same cold precision that had guided him here, Leandro began the next part of his plan. Leandro knew he couldn't afford any mistakes. Every second that passed was another chance for someone to notice something unusual. He forced himself to breathe, to remain steady. The plan wasn't over yet. If he wanted to walk away free, he had to make it look like something he wasn't a part of. He took one last glance at Maritza and Dr. Nolan Hensley, their bodies lying motionless on the hotel room floor. The sight should have made him feel something: guilt, regret, fear. But he felt nothing. They had betrayed him. They had made their choice. Now he was making his. The first step was eliminating evidence of his presence. He moved carefully, wiping down everything he had touched: doorknobs, light switches, even the edges of the bed frame. He was meticulous, erasing any trace that could link him to this room. Next came the crime scene itself. It had to look like something other than what it was. A lover's quarrel gone wrong? A robbery? An accident? He considered his options before settling on something simple but effective. He retrieved a small knife from his pocket, the kind that wouldn't attract much suspicion if it were later found discarded. With precise movements, he made shallow cuts on Maritza's wrists and a deeper one on Hensley's side. Enough to create a story without drawing too much forensic attention. He overturned a chair, pulled out dresser drawers, scattered a few personal items across the floor. It needed to look chaotic, as if things had spiraled out of control. A desperate act, between two lovers whose passion had turned violent. Before leaving, he checked his appearance. No blood, no sign of struggle on his clothes. He smoothed out any wrinkles in his shirt, adjusted his jacket, and made sure his disguise was still in place. He had come in unseen, and he intended to leave the same way. Exiting the room, he moved. Quickly but not suspiciously. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. Just a man walking away from a hotel, nothing more. The moment he stepped outside, the night air hit him, but he didn't stop. He reached his car, slid inside, and drove off without looking back. The alibi was already in motion. Surveillance cameras in different parts of the city had recorded him elsewhere, ensuring that when the police looked into this, he wouldn't even be considered a suspect. Phone records would show he had been in a completely different location, his digital footprint carefully manipulated to keep him in the clear. By the time he got home, he was calm. He showered, changed clothes, and went about his routine as if nothing had happened. The house was quiet, too quiet, but he told himself that was temporary. Eventually, people would start asking questions. The next morning, the news broke. Reports of 2 bodies found in a hotel room, an apparent case of violence between lovers. The media speculated about what had happened, painting a tragic story of passion turned deadly. Leandro watched, sipping his coffee, emotionless as the world tried to piece together a puzzle they would never solve. Detectives came knocking a few days later. Standard procedure. They asked about Maritza, if he had noticed anything unusual before she disappeared. He played the grieving husband perfectly, worried, confused, devastated by the loss. He provided them with every detail they needed, leading them to believe he was just another victim in this terrible tragedy. The investigation dragged on, but Leandro remained untouchable. The forensic evidence supported the theory of a crime of passion between Maritza and Hensley. No forced entry, no signs of a third party. Just 2 lovers who had met their unfortunate end. Months passed, and life moved forward. The world forgot about Maritza and Dr. Hensley. The hotel room was cleaned, rented out again to people with no idea of what had happened there. The story faded into the background, another unsolved case lost in the sea of tragedies. And Leandro? He walked free. No one ever suspected the truth. No one ever would.